director of the World Wildlife Fund's Arctic program, which was a collaboration with Russia. And I'm going to remember that we're recording this, so everybody knows that this recording is in process. Um, in this session, Margaret will provide an overview of some of the unique ecosystems of the Arctic Ocean, particularly those shared between Alaska and Russia, and some of the current challenges of transboundary collaboration, especially right now with the war in Ukraine. There's basically no communication between scientists in Russia and the US, which is really pretty challenging. Um, so next week, just to give you a little idea, Rick Sennett, the former area biologist with Alaska Fish and Game, and I are going to give a presentation on intensive wildlife management. There's an intensive management law that was passed earlier, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about moose and caribou and bears and wolves, and so that's what we'll do next week. So Margaret, I think we're ready, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, and can you see me on your screen now?
We can't see you yet, but I think we will make it so we can see you, and then once you get started, we'll just go directly to the slides. Moses, can you help us see Margaret for a few minutes? There we go. Thank you, Margaret.
Hey, great. Okay, well, thank you, John, for having me, for inviting me to your class. And also just wanted, I saw a scene of the setup that you have there. I am going to show a couple of maps with little dots on them. So if people would like to move up forward, it might be easier to see the maps, but of course, do whatever you're comfortable with, just as a little preamble. And also, I wanted to say that I'm sure you've discovered this already, and I bet some of you knew John before you signed up for this course, but John is one of the people I just admire so much in the conservation community. As you know, he's such an accomplished biologist who did cutting edge research, especially in the Tongass National Forest, but continues to contribute so much to conservation and science outside of his career. And I just admire all of that work that you've been doing and continue to do, John. So thanks for including me in your class. My presentation today will be about 45 minutes. And I am going to do a few things. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm hoping I can surprise you with some facts and figures about Russia that you may not have known, even though we do live in Alaska. I'm actually from, I live in Alaska now. I've been there for 20 years. At the moment, I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because I'm doing a fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School. But anyway, so I hope to surprise you with some interesting information about Russia. As John said, I'll talk about some of the common species and ecosystems as well as cultures, and speak about some of the challenges we're facing now. And then I'll wrap up by telling you where things stand now between Alaska and Russia. And just a little preamble to this presentation. I became interested in Russia because I was studying the Russian language in college in the late 1980s. And in 1989, I read of an agreement between Mikhail Gorbachev, the last secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR, and President Bush, the first George Bush, to create an international peace park. And this was the time of perestroika. You might remember that term, rebuilding of relations between the West and the Soviet Union. Glasnost was another term that characterized the region, meaning glasnost means openness. And Gorbachev really started to relax a lot of what had been a very strict regime of the public. And it was also a time when the West and the Soviet Union were finally talking about arms control. So it was a really interesting time to be watching the end of the Cold War. And they signed this agreement for the idea of a peace park across the Bering Strait, combining areas of Alaska and Russia. And the following year, Audubon, the Audubon Society of Alaska, and maybe some of you are members of Audubon. I met John when he was at Audubon as a scientist. Audubon published this article, this cover story, which says a daring Soviet-US plan to protect Arctic wildlife. And that was, that just captivated my interest. I thought, what an exciting way to conduct diplomacy through conservation and shared science. And so the following year, just the following month, so that magazine article was published in July of August. The very next month, I started graduate school, and on August 19th, the Soviet Union officially imploded. Gorbachev gave up his position. Yeltsin came to power as the first president of what then became the Russian Federation. All of the other republics became independent countries, and it was a huge seismic shift in geopolitics in the entire world. And from the conservation point of view, it opened up, there were so many new opportunities that opened up for collaboration between the West and Russia, and certainly between Alaska and Russia. And so the following summer in 1992, I had a chance to go through, it was actually through an Audubon Society partnership with scientists in the Russian eastern region of Magadan. And I had a chance to go with a small grant while I was in graduate school to Magadan, where I discovered a huge network of people who had devoted their lives and careers to protecting wildlife, to studying nature and natural ecosystems. And they were part of a broad network that spread all across Russia of different types of protected areas. And I'm going to describe some of those areas in a moment. And I'm there in the green t-shirt to the far, let's see, my left, to see somebody looks more American than the others. That was Kent Wall from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Early on, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, based in Alaska, started coming over to talk to Russian counterparts about efforts to potentially collaborate. So it was just such an exciting time. And that led me to what became 30 years of working with Russian scientists, indigenous communities, government officials. I ended up working with World Wildlife Fund, or at World Wildlife Fund. I became the managing director of the Arctic program. I was based in Anchorage. Here's a picture 30 years after standing near that helicopter. I had the chance to visit some very remote areas in the Russian Arctic with the Inupiat leader, Charlie Johnson, who was from Barrow at the time. No, from Nome, excuse me. Charlie was from Nome. And we went together to Russia to work on a joint polar bear project, which I'll tell you about later. But it was a wonderful 30 years of just so many exciting opportunities and areas of common shared goals and common interests. And as I mentioned, I was with World Wildlife Fund. It was just another example of the. It was a time when you could move freely around Russia. There was a vibrant nonprofit organization community, and the science community was also so excited to be connecting with not just the United States, but Europe as well. So really, really quite a 30 years that we had starting in 1991. And I know you all are in Alaska right now, and Russia isn't very far away, but I'm going to just show you this map anyway to remind you of how close. If you look at the top, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but anyway, if you're sitting in the room, it might be hard. But at the very top of the map, you can see Alaska, which of course is the reason why America is an Arctic country. Alaska is just separated by 50 miles of water, or between in the Bering Strait here. The Bering Strait separates Alaska and the Chukotka Peninsula. And this polar projection map also shows us how extensive Russia is part of the Arctic. Russia occupies about half of the Arctic seacoast. And Russia is home to so many wilds and rich ecosystems. A fifth of the world's forests, boreal forests primarily, are found in Russia. A fifth of the world's freshwater supply is in just one lake alone here called Lake Baikal. You may have heard of it. I'm showing it's on the right part of the screen, southern Siberia. That's Lake Baikal. It's the oldest, longest, and deepest lake in the world and contains all of the water equal to the combined Great Lakes. Just an amazing resource. I actually had the chance to skate across Lake Baikal about 5 years ago, but that's another story. Russia also has tremendous marine ecosystems, and some of the most productive fisheries and marine habitats are found in Russian seas. One of those is the Sea of Okhotsk, shared with Japan. There's at the top of the map. And around the world, 2 of the largest fisheries, whitefish fisheries that are found that occur anywhere in the world, are in Arctic waters and are shared between Russia and another country. So, for example, in the Barents Sea here, and I'm pointing with my cursor, I'm at the bottom of the map. If you can't see in the crowd, but you see Norway. So Norway and Russia up here share the Barents Sea. That's a major cod fishery. And then back at the top of the map between Alaska and Russia, we have the Bering Sea, different from the Barents Sea, which is also a place where we have a huge pollock fishery, which is a very big driver for Alaska's economy, for the national economy, and an example of some of our shared resources. Russia also is home to huge mineral resources. It has the largest natural gas reserves, 2nd largest recoverable coal reserves, 8th largest oil reserves. And now at this time of the so-called green transition, as the world is transitioning to a green economy, green energy, the term critical minerals is quite a hot commodity. And Russia has huge deposits of some of the critical minerals, such as nickel, cobalt, zinc, diamonds, and so on. So it's quite an extraordinarily rich nation. And of course, is the largest country in the world. So many of what as I mentioned, that when I went to Russia, I discovered that that the country has this extensive system of protected areas. And I'm going to speak a little bit about those categories. The first being, which I'll elaborate on more, called Zapovednik. I'll define that in a moment. Russia has a national park system, just as we do. Our park system is much older. Their first national park was created in 1983, largely based on the US model. They have a system of zaказniks, which are very similar to our wildlife refuges or our state parks. And then they have a system of nature monuments, just as we do. Let's see. No, for some reason. Okay, so this map, it's in Russian, but it's just to give you an indicator of how these protected areas, these designated areas, are spread across the country. Red shows the strictly protected nature reserves, the Zapovedniks. Purple are national parks, and yellow are the zakazniks, the areas that are like our wildlife refuges. And you can see Moscow in the far west. And about 12% of Russian territory is protected in these highest categories of protection. But so I'm going to go back to the term Zapovednik. This is what was so exciting to me to discover. This is a category of protected area that is the highest category of protection, and it is the regulations that accompany it mean that people are not, basically it's very unlike our park system, because people are not allowed in these Zapovedniks. They have a mission for conservation and research. And so Russia is currently the country that devotes more land than any other country to this strict level of protection. Today, there are over 100 Zapovedniks, and they encompass a total of about 85 million acres. And just as a note of comparison, our park service, just our national park system alone, is equivalent to that system, and also contains about 85 million acres. But unlike, our parks, as you know, have roads, have campsites, have interpretive signs, visitor centers, trails, all of that. The Zapovednik system was not designed for public engagement, and that had its benefits and costs. But that's one of the big ways that it differs from other protected areas. And the idea of this strictly protected area was developed by scientists in the early 20th century. They envisioned what they thought of as models of nature, areas that could be set aside where nature could just do its thing unimpeded from humans. So They wanted places where rivers could flood and where humans and beavers could create dams, or species could migrate, or forests could burn down and regrow without any human interference. And they also wanted a system of areas that would be representative of all of the country's diverse nature types. They didn't want just the cool old faithfuls and the beautiful Grand Canyons to be encompassed in the system, but just like a library to show all of the different types of natural ecosystems that could be found in Russia. They also envisioned a system of monitoring that should be systematic in all of these areas. And scientists were trained to conduct observations on when certain plants are blooming, when migrations are occurring, when different natural phenomena are happening throughout these reserves. And this program was called Letopis Prirodi, which means Chronicle of Nature. And it's a pretty rich database if you think of wanting to know how nature has occurred over the years. Again, the first nature reserve was created in 1916. And so some of these reserves have records going way, way back that could be really useful in understanding environmental change. And luckily, some of these have been digitized, but I think some of them are still sitting in books and maybe dusty shelves somewhere in these different offices. Another mission of the Zapovednik system was to restore and protect endangered species. This is a picture of the Lake Baikal, a freshwater seal. And Lake Baikal was the place where the first Zapovednik was created, not for the seal specifically, but for a sable, which is like a little marten, a little fur-bearing animal that was almost extirpated after the Russian Revolution. It was overhunted, it was used for the fur trade, and the small remnant population was found. And so some scientists and conservationists said, this is where we'll establish our first Zapovednik, and it still exists today. Another mission. So just a few pictures of some of the endangered species. This is a saiga antelope. It's found in one of the Zapovedniks in the southern steppe region of Russia, which is like our grasslands region. And I just love it because it shows some of the diversity of wildlife that you find in the country. Very rare species that's also been over-harvested for traditional medicine. Another rare species found in the Zapovednik system is the Bieloplechi orlan, is its name. It's called means white-shouldered sea eagle, the stellar sea eagle. And this is found nesting in the Magadansky Zapovednik, which is the first nature reserve where I spent time. Probably the last main mission of the Zapovednik system is to educate young scientists and to allow for training, provide an outdoor laboratory for biologists. And this is a photo taken quite a while ago of some students, high school and university biology students. So I mentioned earlier that these places were not open to the public, and for the most part, they still aren't, but some allowances were made to permit young or any scientists to come in and do field work in these nature reserves. Today, even though most places don't allow people in the reserve, many Zapovedniks have developed educational programs, and they invite kids or school programs or adults to some place on the edge of the reserve. They put out environmental education material, and they are trying much more to educate the public, not necessarily, again, by having people in the territory, but doing some programs to connect people with understanding what they have in their backyard. I'm just going to mention a few of the existing protected areas. One of them is in the Arctic, and it's one of the most famous ones, called Wrangel Island Zapovednik. And it's found, if you can see, it's up in the Arctic Ocean, north of the Chukotka Peninsula. You see off to the right is Alaska. So hopefully you're getting the sense of where it is geographically. Wrangel Island is known for it being what we call the polar bear nursery. It's where the largest onshore denning concentration is of female polar bears. There are rare and endangered species like the spoon-billed sandpiper, muskox. It was used as a place to try to restore populations of muskox, which were introduced in the 70s. And what's interesting is that the on-land portion of the Wrangel Island is almost 2 million, but then a marine buffer zone was created around the reserve. So that added another 3 million acres of coastal and marine waters. And today, Wrangel Island comprises about 5 million acres, which is similar in size to our Katmai National Park. Oops. Just a few little samples of some other areas. One is the Commander Islands Nature Reserve, where I've spent some time. The Commander Islands are the eastern or the westernmost extent of our Aleutian Islands. If you picture where the Alaska's Aleutian Islands go, you just pop over the maritime boundary into Russia, and the Commander Islands are there, very similar to our Aleutian Islands with seabirds and marine mammals. Oops, this picture didn't turn out very well. Just another spectacular area is the Altai Mountains in the southern part of Russia, where Kazakhstan, China, and Mongolia come together. One place I've spent a lot of time is Bryansky Les, Zapovednik in European Russia, where one of the last undammed rivers still floods, gives way to huge wetlands, and provides habitat for a number of rare nesting birds. As I mentioned, Russia also has a system of national parks, much newer than the Zapovednik system. And one I'll mention, there are, how many other? I think 64 national parks now. One of them is a place in the Arctic. I had a chance to spend about 3 weeks there during a sabbatical from WWF several years ago. And it is in an area similar to our probably boundary waters in Minnesota, where lakes and boreal forests come together. And this park protects not just natural heritage, but cultural heritage. The director was an art historian, and the park was created just as the Soviet Union was falling apart. The economy was in shreds, and she did a tremendous job to take in local farmers and wood forestry workers and put them to work in restoring some of the most amazing treasures from the 18th century, places, little chapels and icons and wooden structures that had escaped destruction during the Soviet period, because any religious object was under target for destruction during the Soviet period. And then she's helped to revive and protect traditional stories and legends and people who know the legends. That tree is considered a sacred tree, and this park has a number of what they call sacred groves that people have always avoided. They'll never cut timber in the sacred grove, and just understanding about that is just passed down through generations. And these are just some scenes of the beautiful landscape. And my friend Yelena, the director, always considered the elders as part of the cultural heritage. And thank goodness, when she became the director, she understood how precious their knowledge was of the landscape and the legends and the stories. And she invited many academics and experts to come record some of the amazing history that these women, especially women, knew. And this is just some, I spent 3 weeks in February there several years ago, just to show you what it looked like. And she has, this director was able to attract huge amounts of investment through various sources in the West to help restore some of these places. And just in August, the whole park was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And she's just a picture of local crafts are also being activated. So that particular national park is in the far west of Russia, or the Russian Western Arctic. But if we come back closer to Alaska and we look at the area between Russia and Alaska, there is so much that we share in common. And I'll start with the Bering Strait. Here's a close-up of the Bering Strait. These are the Diomede Islands right in the middle of the Bering Strait. The big one on the western side is Big Diomede, or Rachmanov Island, which is Russian. And then the Little Diomede is a village where I think about 100 Alaskans live today. And so that international boundary and the maritime boundary goes right between the two islands. And you can see this, just that portion of Alaska peeking out to the east. So this is a place, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to be up in this part of the world, but often I think when people envision the the Bering Strait or the Arctic, they picture something like this just severe, harsh, extreme sea ice covered environment. And it is true that it's like that, but this is a tremendous, vibrant ecosystem, which is fed in large part, is supported in large part by these microorganisms underneath the sea ice called copepods. And there are billions and billions of these copepods, which feed fish and whales and are part of supporting this really rich food chain, which includes animals at the top of the food chain, like the Pacific walrus. Baleen whales eat a lot of copepods. This is a group of bowhead whales. And right now, let's see, okay, we're in November. So the bowhead whale migration is so amazing. It's every spring, tens of thousands of bowhead whales are hugging the Alaskan coast. They come up from the Bering Sea, sort of turn right and go toward Barrow. And we always hear about the whaling season that takes place in the spring around April. Those whales go over to Canada. And then for the summer, they go back to Russia. They come to Russia, and now they're probably just finishing their southern migration now, going back to the Bering Sea. When they go south, they hug the Russian coast, but when they go north, they hug the Alaskan coast. So we really, together, our two countries have a stake in this shared wildlife population. And I like to call the Bering Strait a marine mammal superhighway, because there is so much life that is passing through that, and there are currents that are passing through that, and fish and birds and seabirds and polar bears and just and people. And people have gone north, south, and west, east for thousands of years in this area. Taking a broader look at the Bering Sea, going a little bit south of the Bering Strait. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you see the two narrow points of land where the Bering Strait is. If you think about the whole Bering Sea, this is a massive resource that's shared between Russia and Alaska. And again, we have so much in common. One of the other aspects of that vibrant life that comes to the region every year is the fact that we have amazing bird migrations. Every year, birds from every continent migrate from Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, to the Arctic shores in Russia and Alaska to nest. Birds are nesting, shorebirds are coming there because there's so much food and so much habitat. And this is a picture of the bar-tailed godwit, which is just an amazing migrator. When it returns to Alaska, when it returns to the Southern Hemisphere, its whole biology and morphology changes, and it flies 8 days on the wing going back to New Zealand. And when it returns to New Zealand, they ring the bells in the village of Christchurch to celebrate the return and the completion of this amazing migration. And there's so many other species that do that. It's an astounding part of our Arctic ecosystems. Salmon are another species that we share in common with Russia. We have both Alaska and Russia have 5 species of Pacific salmon. This is a map created by the Wild Salmon Center, and they use what they call an approach to protecting the strongholds, the last places where salmon are still thriving. And you can see the areas that are colored are basically the high concentration of still wild salmon runs. And you can see Bristol Bay highlighted here, and the Kamchatka Peninsula. But it's one of those things that we have so much in common. And for years, our salmon biologists have been working together actually to map these areas and to identify where the last remaining rivers are with wild salmon and which need to be protected. Of course, salmon have always been part of the indigenous cultures of people and have supported communities on both sides of the Bering Strait for thousands of years. And salmon are part of another food chain on land, supporting brown bears and eagles. And then those bears carry in the nutrients into the inland ecosystems. Just as Alaska and especially Kodiak have those wonderful, huge populations of large brown bears, Kamchatka, Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula has a similar large population. One surprise I like to share with people is that we actually have corals. I haven't diverted to the tropics with this picture, where I'm actually showing you a coral garden photograph from the Aleutian Islands. And our fisheries scientists discovered these corals existing in the Aleutians about in the early 2000s. Russia also has cold water corals off of the Kamchatka Peninsula. The largest coral gardens, cold water corals, are found in Norway, but it's one of those fun secrets and unique ecosystems that we find in the north. I mentioned the rich marine ecological systems in the Bering Sea. That's something we share with Russia, is the existence of the pollock fishery I referred to early, and the dependence that our economies have on the health of the fishery. We actually share a stock with Russia, and for years have our scientists and managers have met on an annual basis to talk about the status of the pollock stock. With climate change, the warming of the Bering Sea is actually looks like pollock are moving. As a result, pollock are moving further. Our shared stock is moving further into Russian waters. So that is a change that's taking place, and another reason why we have to keep talking to each other across the boundary. Our cultures across the Arctic, there are many rich indigenous cultures, and in the Bering Strait region in particular, we have the Siberian Yupik is one of the shared cultures. And I don't know if you can see it, but around St. Lawrence Island, let's see if I can, up around St. Lawrence Island. On St. Lawrence, there are people who are Siberian Yupik, and they have relatives in the Chukotka Peninsula. And I'll never forget attending a National Park Service event, which had invited, through which a group of Chukchi dancers were invited. And they were they started performing over at APU, and the drummers got drumming, and the women were doing their beautiful movements. And all these Alaska women who were sitting in the audience jumped up and joined the women, the Chukchi women. They haven't never met before, they'd never practiced before, but they knew the moves, they knew the music, because they've been celebrating and practicing in the same ways for centuries, just apart from each other. So I thought that was pretty cool. And people are so much a part of life in the region. And as I mentioned, and we all know, they've been living there for thousands of years. And I think that the trait that the fact that communities depend so much on the health of the ecosystem is one thing that both places have in common. This is a successful whaling crew in Barrow, now called Utqiagvik, celebrating, this is a blanket toss, and I happen to be there for Nalukattuk, which is the whaling celebration that takes place in June. On the Russian side, people, yes, are equally tied to nature, and the Chukchi people have both reindeer herding traditions as well as marine mammal hunting traditions. This was a reindeer herder family I met several years ago on the tundra, and here's their mobile home, Yaranga, made up of reindeer skin. So again, lots of wildlife and people that we share in common. And we also have some special challenges, and that has to do with massive change taking place across the Arctic. And I know you talked about it a little bit last week with John, and warming temperatures, warming air temperatures, warming sea temperatures are drastically impacting things like permafrost. Permafrost is the frozen layer of soil that occurs across the Northern Hemisphere. Russia has close to half of the Northern Hemisphere's Arctic. It's a hard figure to pinpoint, but we and Alaska also has permafrost. You can see the extent of permafrost in the purple shades here. And the big thing to remember about permafrost is it contains 2.5 more carbon than the carbon we have in the atmosphere right now. So as warming temperatures thaw the top layer of permafrost, and permafrost release carbon, releases carbon, that's creating a positive feedback loop. More warming, more carbon, warming accelerates, etc. So it's a very, very concerning aspect of warming temperatures. This, I'm going to show this video. I know you talked about it a little bit. Hopefully it will work. Let's watch the another impact, which is the declining Arctic sea ice. This is the minimum sea ice measured usually in September. And you can just see that the years are shown at the bottom of the graph, and through the red line, you can see the extent of sea ice coverage at the top of the Arctic. basically average ice coverage is declining. Can you see that okay, John? Okay. I see some nodding on the screen. So these changes, I know, and we hear about it in Alaska every day, but we have certainly seen the impacts on sea ice dependent species such as polar bears. Basically, the loss of sea ice means a loss of habitat for them. Walrus also depend on the sea ice as a platform from which they dive to reach their favorite food, which is clams and worms, and they use their whiskers to dig around in the mud, but need that sea ice as a way to access their food. Longer seasons without ice and more open water mean that offshore development, such as offshore oil, is becoming more accessible. And you may remember in 2008, there was a big proposal by Shell Oil to have an offshore oil development in the Chukchi Sea. That was rejected, luckily, in my opinion. But there are places in Russia where offshore oil development is growing in the Arctic. Open water, longer open water seasons also are allowing for longer shipping seasons. And that's a big change that we are seeing in our part of the shared Arctic. This map shows, I'm looking at the Russian coast, and Russia has now developed what they call the northern sea route, whereas 30 years ago, it would have been impossible and impassable for ships to come through this area. But now with the declining sea ice, Russia is using this sea route to export many of its mineral riches, which I mentioned earlier in the call. And because of the sanctions on Russia and more the exodus of many Western companies, Russia has really had to look for new partners. China was already investing in Russian oil and gas development, and some of those developments are shown in white squares here down in this part of Siberia, and these different colors make up the northern sea route. But all of this means that China and Russia now have this growing alliance, and China is Russia's biggest oil importer. And this means that more traffic is coming through the Bering Sea, that marine mammal superhighway. The upper chart on the right shows the total numbers of vessels that have been transiting the Bering Strait. And you can see the number didn't shrink after Russia invaded Ukraine. The numbers increased because Russia is, again, working with India and China to try to get its oil down to Asia through the Bering Strait. For years, there has been significant collaboration between Russian scientists and conservationists. And I'm just going to quickly mention some examples of that cooperation. One of them had to do with invasive species and the reintroduction of a species called the cackling goose, or Aleutian cackling goose. And the Fish and Wildlife Service throughout the Aleutian Islands had learned that the introduction of foxes because of fox farming had decimated the Aleutian cackling geese. And Fish and Wildlife but found a remnant population of cackling geese on one of the islands, I believe it was Bull Deer in the Aleutians, and went on a massive effort and got funding and support for biologists to remove foxes from the islands and to help the recovery of the cackling goose. Over in Kamchatka, the exact same thing had happened. Fox farming had brought foxes to all of the islands in the Russian Far East. Cackling geese were completely decimated, and a Russian biologist heard about the success of the reintroduction program in Alaska and started writing to Alaskan colleagues and Japanese colleagues who had also been helping with the recovery. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, accepted this plea for help and literally rounded up dozens and dozens of Aleutian cackling geese, put them on not just overnight, but there was a lot of correspondence. I've actually seen the letters in Russian and Japanese going back and forth. But Greg Sakanik, if any of you know him, was the director of the superintendent of the Maritime Wildlife Refuge, literally himself helped to round up dozens of cackling geese, put them on planes and these pet carriers, on Alaska Airlines and sent them over to Kamchatka. And my friend Nikolai Gerasimov had built a little very homemade, but very effective breeding facility in his backyard in Kamchatka. And for 20 years, captive bred and worked on releasing Aleutian cackling geese. And I got to go with him on his last release onto an island south of Kamchatka where there were no foxes. And since then, that was in 2010, the numbers of geese have flourished. The geese now migrate to Japan, and that population seems to be thriving in Russia, just as it is in Alaska. So that's one area where collaboration really helped. And here's Nikolai scooting off one of his captive geese, saying goodbye as it goes off into its new wild life. Another area where our ornithologists have collaborated was in the conservation of a rare albatross called the short-tailed albatross. These were very, very endangered because they had been overhunted. Then the last remnant of their nesting area was on a volcanic island in Japan. So they really were very much on the edge. And one of the problems was the existing birds were getting caught in long lines. They would, this is a long line vessel. They would come and swoop in and try to grab baited hooks as the bait was being distributed off of a long line, and then the birds would get entangled and drown. And in Alaska, fishermen and scientists worked together to come up with a very simple device, but was proven to be 80 to 100% effective in scaring seabirds away from the fishing line. They're called Tory lines, and they're just hang off the stern of a boat. You see these red plastic lines, they're like flags, and they scare seabirds away from the baited line. And we went, when I was at World Wildlife Fund, we brought an American fisherman, an American scientist over to work with the Russian counterparts. We went down to the Russian docks and had the American fishermen from Alaska talking about, hey, we save a lot of money and we don't care about birds, but we like money and we don't want to waste our bait. And I really recommend that you try them. And so after several years of having our scientists work with the Russian scientists and so forth, the Russian captain said, yeah, we want to do this and we are going to use the streamers, and they still continue to use streamers today. And that is has reduced seabird bycatch by 80 to 100%, meaning we're saving tens of thousands of seabirds every year. And here are some other examples of things that we did in Alaska. We also recommended to do in Russia, and they adopted them. And I actually was involved in carrying some of these streamers over from America to Russia to trial on the Russian fishing vessels. They came in these big white buckets, so they're pretty easy to carry. One area of collaboration has been preparing for oil spills and shipwrecks. And as I mentioned, traffic is increasing through the Bering Strait. We're really, really worried that there could potentially be an accident. And until the Ukraine war, the United States Coast Guard was working with the Russian Coast Guard and thinking about, okay, how do we plan for an accident? Where are the special places we need to protect? Who do we call? What assets do you have? What kind of equipment do you have? And so forth. And World Wildlife Fund, I was involved in a meeting, an in-person meeting in September of 2021. It was really exciting. The Russian Coast Guard came and the American Coast Guard, we all met in Anchorage, talked about what's possible. They're planning to do an in-water exercise the next spring, like really like going through the motions with crew, with vessels. And then of course, Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. And all of the collaboration, all communication between federal agencies was halted immediately. So none of that planning and cooperation is going on right now. I think I'm getting to the end of my time, John, but I'll just wanted to give you one happy story about collaboration, and that involves two Chukchi colleagues I got to know by studying, not by studying, but through the exchange of people who are experts in polar bears. There were a number of both Russian scientists and Chukchi colleagues coming to Alaska, and people were going back and forth. And I had the chance to meet two brothers who are very knowledgeable about polar bear and walrus biology, because they live on the ocean and they live on the coast and they're constantly observing. And they live in a tiny village on the Russian Arctic coast. This is one brother, Sergei Kavry, and his brother, Vlad. And they had, as I mentioned, because of the sea ice habitat shrinking, polar bears are losing their habitat. And in many places, polar bears are coming on shore much earlier than they should be, spending way too much time on land. I happened to be in Kaktovik in July 2019. On July 1st, a mother and two polar bear cubs swam ashore. She should have been out on the ice, but there she was going to be stuck in Kaktovik waiting for the sea ice to come ashore. So this same thing was happening in Russia. And in the early 2000, I think it was 2007, a young girl in the neighboring village to where these guys live was killed by a polar bear. And they were, the Kavry brothers were very concerned that something could happen like that to their village too. So this is just some scenes from their village called Vankarem. About 140 people live there. So they got together. So I mentioned polar bears getting stuck on land. As the sea ice is going out, also the walruses need to come ashore, not just polar bears. But in this village, they were seeing huge numbers of walrus come ashore because the walrus need a place to rest. They need a place where they can access shallow water. And so the beaches of Vankarem happen to be a very convenient place. And the walruses, at the slightest disturbance, walruses can get very skittish and they cause stampedes. So here's a picture of their village. You can see the village in the background and this tremendous number, 30 to 40,000 walruses concentrated right in their front yard. And if a dog would go near the walruses or anything disturbing, a helicopter or any kind of flight would come near, the walruses would stampede and leave these carcasses behind. So they were really worried that polar bears would come into town and start feeding on the walruses. They got a group of villagers together and started to move some of these carcasses out of town. They called it to be a feeding point. And it's not the idea of let's feed the wild animals, but let's distract the animals from coming into our village. And so they moved some of the carcasses, and the polar bears that were on land came to these places and stayed outside the village. And if they came to the village, they were fat and happy and not wanting to harass people. And so these guys were able to protect both the polar bears and the walrus and people. That was the main thing. They also ended up creating a local protected area. They got in touch with the aviation community. They established some rules for the local villagers, about you could come and watch them, but not disturb them. They didn't want people to bring dogs or any kind of vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very grassroots type of movement to protect this walrus haulout. We invited them to come and tell their story to Alaska, and they traveled from Chukotka to Point Lay. They went to Point Hope, Point Lay, Wainwright, and Barrow, and it was really exciting to see the interaction between the Alaska Native hunters and the Chukchi hunters. And I'll never forget Vlad, who's at the very end. He's got a WWF shirt. He was the Chukchi, one of my Chukchi friends and colleagues. He stood up in front of this auditorium in Wainwright, and you could have heard a pin drop. And he was recalling times when there was famine in Russia, both at various times. But he also had in mind when the Soviet Union fell apart, you couldn't find a thing in the stores. And he said, in times of trouble and difficulty, the polar bears and the walrus helped us. Now it's time for us to help them. And he talked about what they had done in Chukotka to protect the walrus, to protect the polar bears, and to try to reduce disturbance to the walrus. And he said, and I think you are going to have the walruses coming to your shores soon enough. A couple of years later, the exact same thing happened in one of these villages. And those communities in Alaska said, remember what our Chukchi brothers said. We're gonna, let's get on the phone. Let's make sure there is no disturbance. We don't want any tourist planes coming. We don't want any boats. We don't want people coming to gawk at them. We're gonna protect the walrus haulout and make sure that they are able to rest and be undisturbed. So that was a pretty neat example of the Chukchi experience informing the Alaska experience. finally, I just wanted to end with this photo, which I love. It shows the world at night, and you can see America, North America down at the bottom, and Europe over to the east. And this is kind of a reminder to me of why the Arctic is so special. You can see very few lights, and of course we have some lights in Anchorage and up there in Prudhoe Bay at the top of the state, but the Arctic is still a place, despite all of this of climate change and yes, increasing industry, but it is still a place where we have huge, vast, intact habitat, still areas that are undisturbed. And so when I think of the opportunity to protect it, we really do have to work across boundaries with Canada, with Russia, and the rest of the Arctic to protect these special areas for our wild places and our wild lands. And so I think I'll stop there. I was going to
Margaret,
talk about the current
thank-
situation, but I can answer questions about what's going on now. Why don't I stop there?
Okay, if you want to go ahead and take another 5 minutes, that's fine. Up to you.
Okay. All right. Well, I will, I guess I'll just say that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. State Department the U.S. government put out a guidance to call for the wrapping up. All federal agencies should wrap up any work and conduct no more research and should not be in communication with Russian partners. That meant all of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service work, any collaboration or information sharing between NOAA fisheries and the Russian counterparts, all of that was stopped. And unfortunately, the very now repressive Putin regime really cracked down on non-governmental organizations. And so even though the State Department, the US said, you nonprofit, you non-governmental organizations can still communicate with your Russian counterparts, it became very difficult in Russia because many groups in Russia were and any Western ideas have become and Western messages have become anathema in the Putin regime. And so many groups doing really important work, which actually had been lauded and recognized by the Putin Ministry of Environment and conservation systems, many of these groups were just declared foreign agents and had to stop working. And so one of those organizations was World Wildlife Fund Russia. And it was really, really difficult. I had known these people for 30 years. They devoted just their lives and souls to protecting nature. And that whole office had to close because of what was happening in Russia. Many other organizations in Russia have closed. And there is almost no communication, very little communication, because those groups are somewhat at risk if they continue to work with their Western counterparts. So it's very, very sad from the point of view of environmental risk in the Bering Strait. I'm deeply worried. I worry about that this is a time when we have global biodiversity loss. We have massive climate change. It's a time when all hands on deck are needed. All countries need to be working together. And here we have the largest country in the world with so much of the Arctic, so much biodiversity, not at the table in part because Putin is anti-Western, and also because the West has isolated and uses diplomatic isolation to keep to ensure that we are not kind of authenticating the Putin regime. So it's a very difficult situation, but that's where we are.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a great presentation. Let's give her a little applause. And can we go ahead and turn the lights on in our room here? And then I'm going to pass the microphone on to anyone that has a question. And I'll have a question first. There's no formal interchange of communication, data, ideas. Is there any informal kind of communication going on between scientists?
Yes, and one exception with respect to formal, I have asked the Coast Guard about this problem of oil spill preparedness, and they say if there is an oil spill, we can talk to each other, we can call each other. But that's the worst possible scenario. Once oil is in the water, forget it. We all know that about Exxon Valdez, about over and over every oil spill and any icy waters is, it's just, you don't want to go there. And so what we really need to be doing is prevention. So they have said we will have formal communication if there's an accident. There is informal communication through people like me who used to work in the nonprofit sector. And I'm able to communicate with a lot of Russian colleagues. I've attended meetings in third-party countries where some of those Russians have come, where they can safely communicate with Westerners. And there are some, but it's very, people are worried. Americans don't want to put Russian colleagues at risk, and not all Russian colleagues feel completely comfortable. So we use, we use WhatsApp and other types of communication. And then there's some friendly communication, very unofficial. I've been in touch with some Russian officials in a very friendly, very superficial way, which I appreciate even that, because at least they know that there's somebody out there and that we know that there's somebody out there. And hopefully when something gets normalized, we'll be able to reestablish ties. And that's one of the things I worry about most, is that when I started working in this part of the world, I inherited some relationships from, for example, I don't know if any of you remember Dave Klein. John certainly will. He was at Fish and Wildlife, but then he ran the Audubon Society. He was the reason I got to Russia, and he knew so many Russian polar bear scientists, ornithologists, and so he kind of handed off those relationships to me, and I've handed off relationships to some of the next younger generation who came into WWF. But now I wonder, like, how do we make sure our young people in Alaska have friends in Russia and so forth? And all those exchange programs, if all the things that we did as kids going back and forth, and those programs, when you meet people from other countries, really go a long way to developing a feeling of trust and collaboration, collegiality, that I believe, even at this terrible time when we don't want to give any leeway to a dictator, a violent, murderous dictator, there are Russian people who want to do the right thing, and we still have this practical problem of our climate change and our shared resources need to be addressed. It's a very controversial, and I'd love to, some people say, well, you shouldn't talk to any Russians at all. And I know colleagues who just, I have a colleague who was at a federal agency that was and he worked very closely with Russians. And he said after this happened, he had to leave. He couldn't imagine working with Russians, even though he had so much respect for a lot of people. He just didn't want to be part of that exchange system anymore. So it's not a simple thing.
One side note that I'll pass on. Margaret and I, and Mary Beth, have had a chance to go to Russia together on a cruise boat that catered to natural history, ecotourism. I was representing Audubon, and Margaret was with World Wildlife Fund. Margaret's pretty courageous. We were out at Little Diomede together, and that was pretty cool. And then we went up above the Arctic Circle, and the skipper of the boat, I think there were about 100 passengers, said, well, here's your chance now. Would anybody like to jump in the Zodiac and go swimming in the Arctic Ocean? Margaret was right there in front, and I watched her dive in, and that was pretty courageous. I didn't have that courage. So anybody have questions? This is your chance. Okay, Bob.
Margaret, Bob Waldrop here. Thank you very much for a really impressive presentation. Learned a lot. Thought I knew something, but I didn't. As the situation relating to the war in Ukraine intensifies and Putin and the Russian oligarchies get more and more desperate, Are they invading some of these protected areas in order to sort of internalize their economic development instead of international trade?
Yeah, and I don't, very good question. And yeah, so good to see you. I have heard that yes, the answer is yes in some of these areas. And the budgets have been, everything is sort of being justified in the name of the war. And I only hear snippets, so I don't have very good examples, but I do hear about that on occasion. And so it's interesting. Some of the people who were in organizations that became foreign, that were nominated, that were designated as foreign agents are just have resurfaced, and they're still doing their work. God love them. But they're under now a new title, and they're under a new umbrella. So thank goodness some of those people are still doing the work. They haven't disappeared. And if you're interested in a pretty neat presentation, I'll send the link to John. I just last week was with two colleagues who are from the Russian Far East, and they presented 3 examples where they had environmental victories in Russia, producing results that are still in place today. And so I think that's it's reassuring that despite all of this bad news, that there is still a grassroots movement, and they're still operating in Russia, much weakened, because they can't receive some of the funds that used to come in through the West, but they're still doing their work. So I know, because I didn't answer your question very well, some of them are really watching what's happening in these national parks and nature reserves, and really still trying to defend them. So that's probably about as good an answer as I can get.
Yes. Oh, okay. Question online?
Yes, this is Cindy. And without getting too political, you talked about a murderous dictator and the lessening support for environmental work in general, much less the collaboration between the US and Russia. But we have a new regime coming in. And that regime's head has indicated that environment and law and climate change are off the docket. How do you think that might turn out for the work you've been talking about?
I'm really worried. And we had, for example, I know, John, you talked about the Arctic Refuge last week, and I think the Arctic Refuge will be targeted again, although on the last lease sale, there was very little interest. But a place like John also talked about the National Petroleum Reserve in Teshekpuk Lake. And under Biden, there were millions of acres opened for ConocoPhillips, but there are millions of acres also set aside for conservation. Thank goodness. And that's one of those balancing acts. I'm afraid that those special areas that were agreed to will be on the chopping block. I think it's going to be a really tough time. I think the Ambler Road, we just had the Ambler Road victory, the potential for an Ambler Road to come back, and our own Dan Sullivan has said we need that for security purposes, to get at those critical minerals. There's going to be a lot of change that will not be favorable for wildlife and wild places, I think. And so it's going to be really important for the civil society, for all of you, for our nonprofit organizations, to be vigilant and doing everything we can to hold back the flood.
Thank you.
I'd like to just comment a little bit further on that. I think it's really important for the public to become informed on some of these issues. And I commend all of you to come to a class here on Alaska's wildlife and wildlands, and talk to your neighbors. I think that one key issue to keep in mind is in Alaska and in the United States, we have congressional legislations that set aside places like Denali National Park and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but and then the coastal plain was the decision was to, in the Arctic Refuge, to let Congress decide. Well, an administration can say, we're not going to do oil and gas development in this critical habitat, but a new administration comes in and they can change that. On the Tongass Forest, we talked about the old growth amendment, which is so exciting. After I spent about 40 years working on that issue, this is a huge deal. That's an administrative decision. That's not a legislative, congressional decision. So that could be essentially past history. We'll see. So, you know, it's really important to engage in some of these things and tell the truth respectfully to other people who may not agree with us. You know, I think that administrations come and go, and there's usually a bit of a pendulum swing back and forth, so we just need to, you know, keep vigilant and help inform ourselves and help our neighbors become informed and our friends, and you know, there's a lot of hard work ahead. So more questions for Margaret. She's just a wealth of knowledge on this issue, and Russia and Alaska have so much in common, from, you know, seabirds and sea ducks and bowhead whales and polar bears and walrus and so many more things, including opilio crab and pollock and salmon. And those things are, you know, we really need to be cooperating. So hopefully we'll get back to cooperation in the future. Any other questions, please? Okay, Margaret, thank you so much.
Looks like we had one more at the top, John.
Okay, one more.
Oh, two.
Last one,
okay.
must be me.
Go
Am
for
I
it.
right? Can you hear me? This is Candy. And when we first started out this lecture, one thing, this is fascinating. This was awesome. Thank you so much for presenting this today. But when we first started out, I hope you can hear me, I'm blabbering. When
Yep.
you were talking about the preserved areas, Zapovednik, was that close to it? And I was going
Yes.
to ask you early on, do you think, well, not anymore, but do you think that the photographers, the people that take beautiful wildlife movies, were allowed into those areas before we stopped communicating with Russia?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. In fact, some of the photos I showed were mine. Some I showed were one story I was going to tell, but I thought it was take too long. Was a friend of mine who I met in the early 90s, was one of the founders of one of the Zapovedniks that's right on the Ukraine border, actually. In fact, when I spoke to him a couple months ago, the windows were rattling. I said, Igor, are you okay? He said, yeah, well, some bombs are flying. And I said, shouldn't you go into the basement, or don't you want to hang up? And he said, no, I'll be fine. He's literally right on the border with Ukraine. But that he was, he left his job. He created the nature reserve. He lived there as a young guy. He was inspired by what was there, helped to create it, and then became the director, and then left and became a wildlife photographer. That was really what always made him passionate about, or fed his passion in wildlife. And he has become a famous wildlife photographer. He built a custom-made van and drove it all across Russia and photographed Zapovedniks across the entire country. He started a blog. It was one of the most popular bloggers in Russia for several years, and he would write about wildlife and what was happening in these different protected areas. And it was really, he popularized conservation in these protected areas. It was absolutely brilliant. And so there are a number of people like that doing that sort of work, but Igor is one of the best. And he actually was hired by the Ministry of Environment, and he still is doing that. They created a position for him to continue to document. Actually, he was doing a big project on the virgin forests protected in Russia's Zapovedniks. And he's done exhibits in Moscow. He has two brothers who are photographers. One of them is a film photographer who did a film about bears and one about salmon that have been nationally acclaimed and gotten international prizes. So it's a talented family of photographers. Just one example of one such person.
Other question was there on the Zoom?
Yeah, this is Roger Hudson. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. one real quickie and two maybe broader ones. Just curiosity, one of your first photos in your slide deck was several scientists standing in front of a bunch of cages, and I wondered what you were about to release. That's an easy one. The other ones was, I wonder if you have any observations about what's going on with the Russians ramping up their salmon harvest as a way to get international, currency, and whether they're doing that to the degree that it may harm their stocks. And then the third thing, which is you didn't happen to touch upon it, but I wonder if you have any war stories or comment on the Amur tigers, which is a very endangered species that's in the part of the world we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's great. The first one, that row of cages, with those, they were pet carriers, and each one had 2 Aleutian cackling geese. And that was the last round, the last day we had a release of these geese. My friend Nikolai Gerasimov had, we had a Japanese scientist with us who had been involved in the project for a long time. World Wildlife Fund provided some funding for the helicopter time. It was a very emotional moment because his wife, Nikolai's wife, had been doing this project with him for 20 years, and she had just died of cancer the previous spring. And these geese were like his children. I have a book. Let's see if it's here. He wrote this book with Alla, his wife. It was called 20 Years of Living with Wild Geese. And he knew you wouldn't think that geese have personalities, but he would write about number 68 and how, and what a personality she had. And then number 10 and number 12 got together and they had the cutest group of goslings. And he was just amazing. But he kept very, even though that picture I showed looked sort of maybe like a little bit of a rundown, he was very, very scientific. He got very, very good pedigree, so there wouldn't be any inbreeding. Anyway, that was the last day of the last release of the geese. It was pretty neat. On salmon, I don't. One thing I can say about salmon is that the folks at the Wild Salmon Center and WWF and others, but especially Wild Salmon Center, made a huge push in the 2000s to work with Russian scientists to identify the wild rivers, but also to bring Russian scientists and conservationists and managers to the Pacific Northwest and to Alaska and to places where salmon were thriving, but also where salmon had been devastated, to show like how habitat degradation just can be the death knell in so many ways to salmon. And they also did show places where hatcheries had been problematic. And interestingly, that happened, I guess, right around the right time, because Kamchatka made a decision pretty much not to develop hatcheries. And places down in other parts of the Russian Far East, Khabarovsk region and Primoria, I guess, have been much more intensively developing hatcheries. So that may be more problematic. In Kamchatka, I guess there's one very small run where they do have some hatchery fish, but mostly it's very, very wild. And one fascinating thing, speaking of, well, a positive story is, I don't know if you've all heard of the Marine Stewardship Council, but it's been very controversial in Alaska, but it's basically an ecological certification program. And the idea of the Marine Stewardship Council was to create standards to improve fisheries and fisheries management and to protect habitat of whatever fishery was involved. And the Marine Stewardship Council was introduced to Russian salmon managers in Kamchatka. And now I think 90% of Kamchatka salmon fisheries are certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. And the salmon, when in the early 90s, the economy crashed. It was a total free-for-all. Nothing worked in Russia. And there was just a complete free-for-all. The law enforcement structures fell apart. Everybody wanted to get Western cash. And there was devastating pressure on rivers. There was massive poaching. There were poaching of not just salmon, but everything that had legs and feathers. And but through the Marine Stewardship Council, through other venues, and I think international collaboration, the Kamchatka salmon industry got its act together, and also the management system changed a bit, and now I would say the situation is much, much better in Kamchatka. There are individual lease owners that have management authority over almost at a basin scale, and so they have a stake in protecting their rivers from poaching and from outsiders. But I think it's been less the case in other parts of the Russian Far East. And there are other habitat, there's terrible mining issues, and I mean, there are a lot. I don't mean to make it sound like it's really rosy, but Kamchatka has actually been fared a little bit better in terms of salmon. And the last one, tiger.
Could I jump in one question about the salmon? And that the kind of thrust of my question was that what I've heard is that the Russians have, greatly ramped up their production and flooding the market. And is there any sense that they're doing that at the cost of throwing escapement goals overboard and that kind of thing?
I guess I don't know the answer or where that is right now anyway.
Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
No worry. I'm glad you clarified. If it's happening, it's probably not in Kamchatka. I guess that's my other, the little bit of, there's more hope on Kamchatka for the wild runs. And then with the tigers, that is, I would say, a success story. Just as everything else was targeted in the early 90s, Siberian tigers, also known as the Amur tigers, were really under a lot of pressure. Their tiger parts and skins were valued in traditional medicine and just for, cash on the open market. And the conservation community, World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, many groups from all over the world really invested heavily in setting up anti-poaching brigades in Russia. And that was kind of the first order of business, stop the poaching. So big investment in heavily armed, like you see in Africa, protecting the rhinos, these kinds of rangers, special elite rangers were involved in protecting, stopping poaching. Then a big problem was prey. The prey base, the ungulates in these nature reserves were also getting poached. So that was the next step, was to try to stop the hunting of their prey, and also reintroducing some of the more depleted roe deer and other species. And then education was a big push, and investment in the protected areas. Sikhote-Alinsky Nature Reserve was a big one. There are several which have tigers. That's probably the better known one. And the Russian, that Zapovednik system started to do a lot more with developing programs to engage, like to have these basically pride campaigns, and to try to create a sense of national pride around the fact that these tigers existed in that area. And so the combination of all those things did seem to make a difference. And last I heard, tigers were at about 500, which is still pretty small, but it's much better than what it was in the early 90s, which was probably closer to the high 200s or 300. But it's pretty tough unless there's, and then it's been a whole comprehensive program. In addition to the prey, you also had to have good, well-managed forests and not poaching of timber. So there's been a big comprehensive program. And I hope that with the current funding situation, because so much Western funding just suddenly disappeared overnight, that I hope some of that will stay in place.
Thanks for your great presentation, but especially thanks for your career and all the energy and passion you put into what you've been up to.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. This has been a very great presentation. I'm sure we've learned a lot.
One other thing that I'll just say, since I have a couple more minutes, do we? Oh, no, I guess we have to go. Just that I always feel a little bit guilty when I talk about Russia, because I have friends in Ukraine, and Ukraine is also suffering so deeply. Ukraine also has a system of Zapovedniks, a system of wonderful people devoted to conservation and nature protection. And so it's very heartbreaking and difficult also to know what's happening in Ukraine. obviously I'm speaking about Russia because it's a place where we share so much. And hopefully we will get to a point sooner rather than later when Ukraine can start thinking about conservation. Obviously, there's a massive humanitarian crisis with the war, but there is, Ukraine also has incredible natural heritage and wonderful people that I want to support and am in touch with too. So let's hope for a better future and do what we can to protect Alaska and our wild existing places right in our backyard.